Ray Peat has become one of the most talked about names in the health and nutrition circles of the internet. You hear about Mexican Coke, orange juice, eating ice cream, taking daily doses of aspirin, coffee with gelatin, and a hostility towards seed oils and PUFA, along with many other things. That's the version of Ray Peat that most people know. Lately, there's been a large surge of interest in him, largely because of a bigger shift happening across health TikTok. People who have spent months or years sticking to this raw carnivore diet or keto are now drifting back towards fruit and honey, treating them as useful metabolic foods rather than something to avoid. Even Paul Saladino, once one of the most prominent figures of the carnivore diet, now promotes an animal-based diet centered around a lot of meat, but also fruit and honey and milk. That doesn't mean that Saladino necessarily became a follower of Ray Peat. His framework and his philosophy is still his own, and he makes that clear, but the overlap is obvious. He's even interviewed one of the most prominent followers of Ray Peat, Georgy Dinkov. The problem with this Peat popularization is that the short-term version of Ray Peat starts at the end of his thinking rather than the beginning. It takes the foods and supplements he became known for and treats them almost like a diet in themselves, when Peat never actually created a fixed Ray Peat diet the way the internet imagines one. The orange juice, the aspirin, the thyroid, all of it were practical conclusions that came out of a much bigger theory about what living organisms actually are and what keeps them healthy. Even in his own biography, when Peat was asked to summarize the central idea behind his life's work, he didn't mention sugar or hormones at all. He said, quote, "Energy and structure are interdependent at every level." So to actually understand why Peat gave the advice he did, you have to understand the philosophy behind it. At the center of Peat's worldview is the relationship between energy and structure. He didn't see the human body as a machine that gets built according to genetic instruction and then simply gets fed energy to keep running. He saw the structure of the body itself as something continuously maintained and reshaped through energetic processes. Think about an ordinary car. Once it's built, putting gas in it makes the finished machine operate, but the gasoline doesn't reorganize the engine or repair the frame. A living organism doesn't work that way. Food, oxygen, temperature, hormones, activity, your entire environment, all of it affects the processes that maintain your structure. Your body today isn't the same body you were born with, just kept in motion by calories. Tissue is constantly being repaired and replaced. The nervous system changes with experience, muscles adapt to use, even the way your genes behave and express themselves shift depending on the condition of the organism. Peat took this idea surprisingly far, even applying it to how life first appeared on Earth. He was skeptical of explanations that put genetic information first, as if some kind of code showed up and then instructed ordinary matter how to become alive. He was more interested in the idea that the physical and chemical conditions of the early Earth could themselves push matter towards becoming more organized. In Generative Energy, while considering a possible volcanic origin of life, he writes, "There is a suggestion that life originated in abundance, in an environment rich, at least locally, in complex organic molecules rather than in occasional puffs of molecules generated by lightning or dissolving slowly out of a meteorite." The important word here is abundance. Peat was attracted to a view in which life was not an almost impossible accident, struggling to occur in an otherwise completely dead world, but something emerging from conditions already rich in energy and complex material. He discusses experiments by Sidney Fox in this context. Peat describes Fox heating amino acids on volcanic rock, where they formed much larger protein-like structures. Once water was added, these structures organized themselves into small spheres, and Peat emphasizes that the genetic component could appear afterward. Quote, "Adding a little water, the protein spontaneously formed small self-reproducing spheres, just the size of bacteria. One of their enzyme-like actions was the ability to synthesize gene-like chains from suitable precursor molecules." What matters isn't whether Peat was right about the origin of life specifically. What matters is the direction of his thinking. He didn't want to start with information and ask how information builds an organism. He wanted to start with matter, energy, and environment and ask how organized systems emerge from their interaction. Peat was critical of treating DNA like a computer program containing containing an organism's complete future. Genes matter to Peat, but he just thought that they operated inside the living organism rather than standing outside of it and controlling everything. To Peat, the organism affects its genes just as much as the genes affect the organism. Peat put a large emphasis on epigenetics over genetic determinism. The broader argument leads into one of the most important statements in generative energy. The relation of energy to structure is, I think, the central question of biology. Elsewhere in the same discussion, Peat summarizes the principle by saying that when energy moves through matter, structure can become more organized. The kind of energy also matters to him. He argues that different forms of biological energy production support different kinds of cellular activity and organization. This is where metabolism becomes central to Peat's philosophy. Metabolism simply refers to the chemical processes through which the body transforms food and oxygen into usable energy and material. Usually, people hear high metabolism and think of someone who can eat a lot without gaining weight, but Peat meant something much broader than that. The energy produced through metabolism is what allows muscles to contract and relax, nerves to function, cells to repair themselves, and body temperature to be maintained, and the organism as a whole to respond to its surroundings. For Peat, then, having adequate energy does not merely mean feeling energetic, it affects what the organism is capable of doing. This distinction changes how Peat thought of health itself. Biology usually leans on the idea of homeostasis, which is the body's tendency to keep internal conditions steady. However, Peat thought that stability was not a good enough definition of health because an organism can become extremely stable in a bad condition. Someone under chronic stress adapts to the stress, and the adaptation keeps them functioning, but that doesn't mean the underlying condition is actually good for them. He thought organisms could settle into these lower energy states and start defending them as if they were the new norm. In Generative Energy, he writes that life seems capable, quote, not just to preserve homeostasis, but to move upward in energy and greater generality of structure and function. This is basically his philosophy of expansion and contraction. When you have enough energy, you can support a wider range of behavior and respond to your environment with more flexibility. Under prolonged stress, those possibilities shrink because energy gets concentrated on immediate survival instead. Peat eventually applied the same pattern to learning, perception, art, politics, and even scientific thought. Healthy systems stay capable of changing when something new shows up. Stressed or rigid systems just keep repeating what they already know. Peat originally studied literature and linguistics. In 1960, he wrote his master's thesis on the English poet and painter William Blake. This might sound like an unrelated period in his life and his career before he became interested in physiology, but Peat himself describes a much more direct connection. In Generative Energy, he writes, "When I was a student of literature, I was interested in the apparent energy differences between different writers and different social groups. The literature of dissent, I wrote my master's thesis on William Blake, always reveals an abundance or excess of energy." Peat goes on to say that he began interpreting literary periods and styles partly in terms of the energy and structure of the societies that produce them. His interest then moved toward language itself, especially the relationship between symbols, perception, and the body. He says that Blake's descriptions of images and symbols began making sense to him in relation to brain psychology, and that after several years studying and teaching linguistics, he decided to study the brain. William Blake matters because many of the themes that later appear in Peat's biology were already present in his interpretation of literature. Energy, perception, opposition to rigid systems, suspicion of abstraction, and the belief that reality contains more possibilities than our present theories allow. Peat returned to these ideas decades later in an essay called "Can Art Instruct Science?" William Blake as biological visionary. His Blake is quite different from the common picture of a mystical poet who simply rejected science. Peat argues that Blake was interested in science but hostile towards a particular kind of science, especially the mechanical worldview associated with Isaac Newton, and the tendency to treat mathematical abstractions as if they were more real than direct experience. One of Blake's terms for this was single vision, which Peat explains in his book Mind and Tissue. Quote, "Single vision was his term for the abstracted science of the Newtonians, who said that Only extension and mass were real, classifying everything else as secondary qualities. This requires a little bit of explanation because neither Peat or Blake were simply arguing that quantitative numbers are bad. The problem is what happens when an abstraction that is useful for studying reality becomes muddied with reality itself. If you want to study human beings scientifically, you have to simplify things. You might isolate one hormone, one gene, one cell, or one measurable behavior because otherwise there are simply too many things that are happening at once. Peat had no problem with doing this. The problem appears when the scientist forgets that the isolated part was removed from a much larger living system and begins treating the simplified model as a complete description of the organism. This is basically what Peat sees Blake objecting to in Newtonian single vision. A partial perspective becomes so successful that people forget it is partial. Blake's famous statement that energy is eternal delight naturally appealed to Peat, but the similarity goes deeper than just a shared use of the word energy. Blake thought energy, desire, and imagination were creative forces. Peat read Blake's idea that without contraries there is no progression, the same way seeing opposition and difference as necessary for development rather than problems to eliminate. Structure is necessary. Nothing stays organized without it, but structure becomes a liability once it stops responding to new conditions. The same thing happens to scientific theories. They can organize a huge amount of evidence and still become an obstacle because people refuse to revise it when something unexpected shows up. Peat's next major project was a book called Mind and Tissue, published in the 1970s, where he tried to find a material explanation for these same Blakean ideas inside the nervous system itself. The book largely introduces Russian and Soviet psychology and brain research to an American audience, because Peat believed that tradition offered a way to be a materialist without treating the organism like a machine. Materialism to Peat simply meant explaining mind and consciousness through the physical organism, instead of reaching for something immaterial whenever biology got difficult. He accepted that project, but thought Western materialism usually solved the problem by making matter too simple. If you define matter as dead and passive, consciousness ends up looking mysterious by default, and you have to explain how something with no experience or purpose at all suddenly produces both. Peat's answer wasn't to remove consciousness from nature, it was to give living matter a much bigger role. This becomes especially clear in the way he describes the relationship between the organism and its environment. Quote, "The environment, in a sense, is a completion of the organism's structure, since the organism can't exist in isolation." He then writes, "Our consciousness is interaction. It is a condition for action, but it is also derived from our activity in the world. That's easier to understand through the body's most basic functions. Your lungs make no sense apart from an atmosphere with oxygen in it. Your eyes make no sense apart from light. Language only develops in a world with other people in it. Even the structure of your brain changes based on what you experience. An organism can't be cleanly separated from the environment that it lives in. The environment doesn't just act on a finished individual from the outside, it becomes part of the process that shapes the individual in the first place." This is part of why Peat was so drawn to Pavlov. Pavlov is famously associated with the experiment with the bell and the dog and positive reinforcement. The dog hears the bell and associates that with a treat and does whatever task he's said to do. Most people flatten Pavlov into someone who thought animals could just be programmed through repetition. Peat argued almost the opposite, that Pavlov was fascinated by attention, exploration, and novelty, and even described animals as having instincts for freedom and dignity. Peat stressed that the senses are active, not passive. An organism doesn't just absorb every stimulus that hits it. It looks for things, selects what's relevant, compares new experiences to old, and adjusts its behavior. Novelty especially matters here. Quote, "In exploration, it is novelty which excites the brain and mobilizes the organism for further investigation." This is where his psychology connects back to energy. An organism with enough resources can afford to explore and get curious and change its behavior. An organism under severe stress has fewer options and falls back on automatic responses that have worked before. Freedom, in Peat's view, becomes partly biological, not an escape from the body, but a body capable of more than one response. Under better conditions, energy energy becomes available for things that aren't strictly necessary for survival right now. Play, curiosity, art, relationships, exploration. To Peat, these aren't luxuries stacked on top of biology. They're what a sufficiently energetic organism actually does. By the time Peat wrote Generative Energy, these ideas expanded into a general theory of biology which he called holism. To quote him, holism is the observation that, although natural objects can be resolved in their parts, the parts are to some extent shaped by their participation in the whole object. Knowing everything about the individual pieces of a system does not tell you what those pieces will do once they're organized together. A single note is not a melody, and looking at each note separately does not explain what happens when they're arranged into music. And of course, with what we've been speaking on in my past few YouTube videos on proportion with the physique and art, the same applies there. Peat applied the same logic to cells, organs, and genes and hormones. Their effects depend partly on what's going on throughout the whole organism. This is why he pushed back on any explanation that stopped at genetic determinism, because he saw that as an endpoint, a way of shutting things down, instead of as a starting point and asking questions on what actually happens during development and what role nutrition, hormones, stress, and experience play in producing the final result. To Peat, the organism is a developing system with inherited traits, which its final form depends heavily on what happens to it. Genes can be expressed in different ways based on the environment, nutrition, and many more factors. And I think the most interesting extension of this is to culture and art. If you think of societies that produced high art, literature, painting, sculpture, music, they were all societies of what Peat would constitute as high energy. The same philosophy appears in the way Peat thinks about science itself. He distrusted theories that became so powerful that they determined what scientists were willing to consider possible. If an observation contradicted an accepted theory, Peat thought the observation should at least force people to reconsider the theory rather than simply dismissing the observation. In Generative Energy, he writes, "Once we accept that knowledge is tentative, and that we are probably going to improve our knowledge in important ways when we learn more about the world, we are less likely to reject new information that conflicts with our present ideas." Once you understand all of this, Peat's actual food and supplement takes make sense. Every recommendation traces back to the same question: what conditions let the organism produce energy efficiently and stay flexible, and what conditions push it towards a low energy defense state? This is why thyroid function mattered so much to him. The thyroid controls how efficiently your body converts nutrients into usable energy and oxygen, and Peat treated adequate thyroid function as one of the conditions that let an organism retain a high level of activity instead of relying on emergency stress mechanisms. It's also why he had a very unorthodox view on sugar. By the time Peat found a large online audience, sugar had basically become synonymous with metabolic disease across most health spaces. Peat thought that this was way too simplistic because glucose is one of the body's major fuels. The brain especially runs on a lot of it, and when carbohydrates aren't available, the body compensates in other ways, including releasing stress hormones and breaking down its own tissue. That doesn't mean Peat thought unlimited sugar was automatically healthy. No matter how Peating gets presented on these online circles, his actual argument was that carbohydrates should be understood in the context of someone's metabolic health as a way to speed that up and not treat it as something poisonous or something that you have to stay away from at all costs. The same reasoning runs through his interest in warmth, light, calcium, protein, saturated fat, progesterone, pregnenolone, and aspirin, along with his very well-known criticism of polyunsaturated fatty acids. These recommendations can be debated individually, and plenty of Peat's specific claims are far more controversial than the general philosophy behind them. What connects all of it is that Peat interpreted each one through its effect on energy production, stress, and the stability of living tissue. There's a small passage in Generative Energy about muscle relaxation that ends up being a good brief on his whole philosophy. Contraction obviously consumes energy. That part is obvious. But relaxation also requires energy in order to actively restore the tissue back to a resting state. If energy production is slow, the muscle stays tense longer instead of returning quickly to rest. The common assumption is that activity costs energy while rest is just the absence of activity. Peat's point is that even rest can be an active achievement. The organism doesn't become healthy just by suppressing activity. it needs enough energy to move freely between different states. There needs to be this capacity for flux. Ray Peat was very against dogmatic diets. He didn't want people to follow a Ray Peat diet. Something you see over and over again with Ray Peat's work is the phrase perceive, think, act. And I think this is very important because a lot of the primal guys, or a lot of really any diets, they dogmatize nutrition as something that, has to be followed a specific way for everyone. This is what works for everyone. But no, everybody's different. Everybody has a different starting point, a different metabolic state, a different reaction to certain foods, a different gut microbiome. And this is probably the best way to look at nutrition and health. How can you take what you have, environment that you have, and form this into some sort of energy producing state? Now, that being said, Ray Peat does have some general advice for, diet and lifestyle, right? He heavily stresses high sugar content, and this is I would recommend from real sources, from orange juice, from fruits in general, rather than, drinking Mexican Cokes or having ice cream. Another big thing that is not really spoken about too much in these meme circles is his emphasis on gelatin, on gelatinous foods, and even just supplementing gelatin. You can make Jello or gummy bears if you'd like, but this is a very important factor for your overall health. And there's lots more that I can go into on the Ray Peat diet. That would be a whole different video on its own, just because the diet and the biohacking aspect is very convoluted. There's a lot that goes into it. There's guys like Danny Roddy you can check out, or Georgi Dinkov, and they make great in-depth videos. I plan on interviewing Peaters in the future just to get more of an understanding on the health and nutrition side of things and the biohacking. So stay tuned if that's something you're interested in. I have large plans with this YouTube channel. The goal is basically to fuse nutrition, health, fitness, looks maxing, and history and literature as well into one sort of project, which I think really correspond with each other quite well.